Major Andre Taylor glanced back at his son Malik, who was proudly holding first place at the science fair for his solar-powered drone project. He had shared many cherished moments of his military career, but nothing compared to seeing Malik standing proudly on stage. As they drifted along the edge of the city under glowing oak trees, they exchanged proud stories and shared laughs. Now dressed in casual gray sweatshirt and jeans, Andre changed out of uniform for dinner without looking around. He never cared for attention. However, Malik excitedly recounted how judges selected him until they called his name. Andre smiled softly and touched his windshield gently. "You deserve that win, son. Don't ever doubt it." They eventually reached the calm park where Andre often jogged after shifts. It was a peaceful neighborhood, mostly residential, with police patrolling. When a traffic light turned red, Andre gently tapped the brakes, alerting the officer behind them. Within seconds, police cars swarmed around them, shining high-powered flashlights in their search for a terrorist connection. Andre desperately screamed, "Do not do this! This isn't right!" only to be muted by frantic whispers from his son and other witnesses. The officer finally revealed his badge and saw an unjust treatment. Andre was already bleeding from bruises. However, they didn't listen. Instead, they focused on matching Malik's phone to any criminal database, which resulted in him being arrested for obstructing justice. With 7 minutes still remaining, the unjust treatment continued in a cruel reality that Andre had never imagined. He now grieved over the loss of his country, his son, and his humanity. In the police precinct, sweat and printer toner filled the air. Major Taylor sitting in a hard chair, wrists swollen from straitjacketing. A skeptical Sergeant Collins examined his father's military ID, a fake. Malik paced the precinct, eyes red, clenched fists. An anonymous tip led to the false arrest, the weight of humiliation, and a single question from an officer. Andre's voice felt like cussing. "I was taken for a threat because I looked like one." Collins hesitated, suggested a misunderstanding. "You're wrong about that. You didn't stop me because of a tip. You stopped me because I fit your fear of service members and their families." Release came with no apology, no statement, no explanation. Out into the lobby, Malik hugged Andre, his face bruised and his uniform forgotten. An anonymous tip set off a scandal. Cell phone footage and photos appeared, and social media swarmed with cell phone footage of the unjust episode. A city investigation ensued, culminating in a statement from the mayor, civil rights attorneys offering support. None of it washed away the incident, the son's face when his hero was mocked. By the time the sun had crested over the rooftops of downtown, the image of Major Andre Taylor embracing his son had circled the globe. News anchors replayed the footage of his arrest on loop. His body slammed against the pavement, uniform ID fluttering to the ground. Malik screaming in the background. It was no longer just a story about a mistaken identity. It had become a mirror, reflecting a truth too many had lived, but too few had believed. The city's pulse changed overnight. Protesters gathered outside the precinct by the hundreds, holding signs that read, "Respect the uniform," and "Black Veterans Matter." Mothers brought their sons wrapped in hoodies, standing silently as tears welled up in their eyes. Churches opened their doors for prayer vigils while retired. Military officers, black, white, and brown, marched together down Main Street in full-dress uniforms in solidarity. The mayor, once cautious and reserved, called an emergency press conference, standing beside the city's police chief, who looked visibly rattled. "We failed a man who served this country with honor," the mayor began, her voice trembling. "The city owes Major Taylor and his family more than words." At Andre's house, the phone rang, nonstop. Old squad mates from overseas, community leaders, national civil rights organizations. But Andre stayed quiet. He wasn't looking for fame. He wanted something deeper, something harder to win, respect. Not as a soldier, not as a black man, as both. Inside their home, Malik scrolled through his phone, watching video after video of people chanting his father's name. And something shifted in him. For the first time since that day, he didn't just feel rage, he felt pride. His father wasn't just a hero in the military. He was a symbol in his city. In classrooms, teachers paused their lessons to talk about what had happened. In barbershops and cafes, people debated not just the incident, but the systems that made it possible. Even some officers within the department began speaking out anonymously, admitting that the call, the stop, and the takedown were all avoidable. The pressure mounted. Civil rights attorney Rachel Bennett announced a federal civil rights lawsuit on behalf of Andre and his family. National media picked it up, framing it as a watershed case, the moment when silence in the courtroom gave way to justice in the streets. But Andre wasn't after headlines. He was preparing to speak, not through rage, but through resilience. And as the city swelled with energy, tension, and hope, a single question echoed in every conversation. Would the justice system finally listen, or would it protect its own again? What no one knew was that Andre was about to step into a courtroom, not just as a victim, but as a voice too powerful to ignore. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, yet the tension made it feel silent, like everyone had agreed, without speaking, that the air itself needed to listen. Major Andre Taylor sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight, eyes calm, uniform pressed to perfection. On the opposite side sat the officers who'd tackled him, eyes down, flanked by a wall of legal defense. The judge, an older man with gray hair and heavy brows, entered without flourish. As he settled into his seat, the quiet deepened. Not a murmur, not a cough, just the weight of justice, waiting. Andre's attorney, Rachel Bennett, stood and walked slowly to the center of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice sharp but composed, "today is not about who wears the uniform. It's about whether wearing it protects some and endangers others." She motioned to the screen behind her. The lights dimmed, and then the video played. The footage everyone had seen online now echoed off marble walls and high ceilings, the screech of tires, the barked commands, the thud of a body against concrete, and Malik's voice crying out, "That's my dad. He's military." When it ended, no one spoke. No one needed to. Rachel turned back to the jury. "That's not suspicion. That's bias. That's fear wrapped in a badge. That's what my client was forced to survive." When Andre took the stand, the room tensed again. He spoke with no anger, just clarity. "I've worn this uniform in countries that feared America. I've flown rescue missions into war zones. I've faced people who wanted me dead. But the first time I feared for my life was 10 minutes from my own home in my own country because of my skin." The courtroom didn't breathe. The judge didn't interrupt. The jury didn't blink. Even the officers seated stiffly behind their lawyers seemed to shrink in their seats. Andre's words weren't loud, but they cut through everything. "This case isn't just mine," he said. "It belongs to every black man who's ever had to prove he wasn't a threat, just to survive the day." When he stepped down, the silence lasted several seconds longer than necessary, like even justice itself needed a moment to catch up. The defense stuttered through procedural arguments and policy excuses, but the damage had already been done. The truth had spoken, not through shouting, but through dignity. And the courtroom, built on centuries of selective hearing, was forced finally to listen. It had taken 3 days of testimony, hours of video footage, and countless silent prayers whispered in corners of the courthouse. But now the entire room held its breath. The jury had returned. 12 ordinary people, black, white, Latino, Asian, young and old, filed into the jury box with solemn expressions. Major Andre Taylor sat with his hands folded tightly. His uniform jacket hung on the back of his chair, replaced by a simple dress shirt and the quiet weight of hope. Malik sat beside him, gripping his father's hand so hard his knuckles had gone pale. The judge, serious and unreadable, glanced down at the sheet of paper in front of him. "Will the jury foreperson please rise?" he said. A middle-aged woman stood. Her voice trembled slightly. "In the case of Major Andre Taylor versus Officers Dawson and Blake, we find in favor of the plaintiff." A sound broke through the courtroom, not a cheer, not an outburst, but a soft collective exhale, like a wound finally releasing pressure. Tears streamed down Malik's face. Rachel Bennett closed her eyes, hands clenched in silent victory. Andre didn't react right away. His jaw tightened, his eyes stayed fixed ahead. After all he'd endured, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like validation. Like someone had finally said, "We see you. We believe you. You matter," the judge continued. "We further award compensatory and punitive. Damages totaling $25 million. But the number didn't matter. Not to Andre, not to the thousands watching the verdict. Live streamed across the country. Because this wasn't about money. It was about meaning. In front of the courthouse, The crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers as word spread. Veterans raised American flags. Children lifted homemade signs that read, "He fought for us, we fought for him." Even some officers in uniform nodded in quiet respect. Inside the courtroom, the two officers sat slumped, stunned, their defense team whispering futile next steps. But it was clear they hadn't just lost a case, they had become the face of a deeper rot. A rot that now had a crack of light piercing through. As Andre stood to leave, the judge spoke once more. "Major Taylor," he said, his voice softer, "on behalf of a system that didn't see you when it should have, I am sorry." Andre nodded but said nothing. Because justice wasn't just about apologies. It was about action. And now, finally, it had spoken. The courtroom was behind him now. But for Major Andre Taylor, the real fight had just begun. The verdict had given him justice, but justice in a courtroom was only the beginning. What he wanted, what he needed, was change outside of it. In the weeks that followed the trial, Andre didn't retreat into quiet. He stood taller than ever. He gave interviews not out of pride, but out of duty to speak for the black soldiers, who had come home from war only to find a different kind of battle waiting for them on American soil. On one of the most watched morning shows, the host asked, "Do you forgive them?" Andre paused, looked into the camera, and said, "Forgiveness isn't the issue. Accountability is. I didn't need an apology. I needed the system to look in the mirror." Those words spread like wildfire. The image of Andre in uniform beside his son became a symbol. High schools taught his case in civics classes. Military academies brought him in to speak on racial bias and honor. Civil rights organizations reached out. Cities across the country began reviewing policies on how officers engage with veterans and with black citizens in general. Laws didn't change overnight, but people began asking harder questions. And some of the right people in power, finally started listening. Meanwhile, Andre returned to his unit. He stood before his fellow soldiers, all ranks and backgrounds, and addressed them not as a victim, but as a leader. "This," he said, holding up the very uniform that had been invisible that night on the ground, "doesn't just represent service. It should represent dignity, and that should never be color-coded." After his speech, his commanding officer embraced him, whispering, "You didn't just serve the military. Andre, you served the country again." Malik, once afraid and angry, now walked with confidence. At school, he held his head high, not because his father had won a case, but because his father had shown him what it meant to stand up even when the world tried to knock you down. In their neighborhood, things changed too. People waved more, spoke more. The silence that had once hung heavy, like a warning, now felt like peace, slowly returning, not perfect, but healing. And one morning, as the sun poured through their kitchen window, Andre sat with Malik and quietly said, "This isn't the end of our story, son. It's just the moment we made sure the world listened." And for the first time in a long time, Malik smiled, not just because the world had changed, but because they had helped change it.